Let's talk more then about the plan. We joined on the line from New Delhi this morning by Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, world politics analyst and dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs from New Delhi. A very good morning to you, Dr. Chaulia. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. It's my pleasure.
Much appreciated. Dr. Chaulia, you've written quite extensively about the plan and you support it. In fact, in one of your writings you said, if it does go ahead, it will represent a high watermark in South cooperation. But how so? Why?
Well, we need it now because of the transition of power from west to east and north to south, and the increasing interactions within the global south. Intra-south global trade and intra-south investment are increasing because of the growth of some of these emerging economies that are captured in, sexy acronyms like BRICS. We also have MIST, which is Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. The whole idea is that we are now at a different juncture in global economic history than what was the case even 10 years ago because of the accelerating and the differences, the dual-paced nature of the global economy, where Europe and North America are in a funk for the last 5 years and don't seem to be emerging out of it, while on the other hand, you have these vibrant economies. So to transfer power from west to east and north to south, you need it to be reflected in the institutional architecture of the global economy. And for that, you need new institutions, new banks. You need to create new regional institutions. So this is I hope that the BRICS, proposed BRICS Development Bank will become the fulcrum and the vehicle to establish that the world has changed, because otherwise it's all talk and there is no action and there is no actual implementation of this transfer of power. So I see it in the big picture as necessary for enhancing South-South cooperation.
But let's talk a little bit about this institutional architecture then, because you already have institutions such as the World Bank. And in reaction to the announcement in India earlier on this year, the former World Bank president, Robert Zulik, said, but the World Bank is already transforming. Already some of the high-profile leaders of the World Bank are from the developing world. Why do we need a new institution?
Well, that transformation is rather incremental. And I don't think, it is not in pace with the change that I've just described, which is dramatic. China, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and a few others are growing at a pace, relatively speaking, even though there's a decline this year, which is much higher than these incremental breadcrumbs that are being thrown from the high table. I am of the view that you need a bold, decisive new institution to change the old order, which was based upon Bretton Woods and the control of European and American capital in all these institutions. So whatever voting shares and little marginal voices that, the BRICS countries are aiming at, for that level of change to happen, it's going to take another 20 years, while the people in the global south cannot wait that long for the developmental and infrastructural needs to be financed and to be created based on a new model of lending rather than the old one, which has been an exploitative one.
But also perhaps another problem here is that there already are a series of regional development banks that were not there when the original Bretton Woods institutes were formed, that are very strong, that are doing some of the work that you would want a BRICS Development Bank to do.
There will be some complementarity with the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, and so on. But remember that even these regional banks are pretty much subsidiaries to the Bretton Woods system. I mean, they have not staked out, for example, a bold move like what we have in Latin America under President Chavez, which is the ALBA initiative and the Bank of the South. I would rather model BRICS to do something along the lines of the Bank of the South, which is to lend among their member countries and within the developing world on the basis of the principle of need, and also on a non-exploitative basis, which is not based on conditionalities that basically essentially strip down the state and its control over the economy. That has been the whole agenda of the Bretton Woods for the last 60 years. Rather, we want a way in which societies and states can develop together through financial assistance from fellow developing countries that are on the upward, and therefore we will have a kind of growth that is symbiotic rather than one in which the state structures are being deliberately weakened at the cost and private enterprise is being strengthened to the point where you have failed states and failing states with no capable institutions. I envisage the BRICS Development Bank to be one which strengthen state structures, but at the same time support societies. That is a key distinction between the Bretton Woods model and their regional banks and which come under their umbrella and this proposed new one. I'm still, of course, talking about the future, and I'm envisaging a bold move. It all really depends upon coordination among the BRICS countries and how clear they are about them presenting an alternative, because I sometimes despair when BRICS countries talk about this BRICS Development Bank as just a bargaining chip in order to get a few more voting shares in the IMF and the World Bank. If that is the case, and this is all, a ruse simply to talk up a threat rather than to create a genuine institution, then, it will be disappointing. I'm speaking more from the point of view of the people in our countries rather than, from the establishments.
Dr. Chaulia, on the currency thing, is it just a media invention, or is there merit in that kind of argument about whose currency will be used?
Well, it is a genuine concern, I think, because there are many. It's not only currency; it's also about where the headquarters of the bank will be. The Indians have one preference, and the Chinese have another preference, and to an extent, I would say the Achilles heel of this whole process is the rivalry between China and India across the developing world, which has re-emerged in a different form, in an economic form of late. So there is concern in India, for example, about China using this BRICS Development Bank as some kind of like a World Bank for China, where it will be the largest contributor. In fact, that's why now there is a provision that people are talking about equalizing the contributions irrespective of the GDP size. Because if you look at GDP size, China swamps everybody else in BRICS. And it could then become the new kind of Washington or a Beijing consensus, or the basis for a Beijing consensus, which nobody wants. So rather, we'll have to look at how we can create and adhere to the principle of parity at every level. So what kind of currency should be the basis for lending? It really depends upon where the Chinese and the Brazilians, Russians, the states which have the large forex reserves have parked them in the euro and in the dollar, and they have not come out of it yet. And we are still talking about, alternative currencies only on the horizon. So it really depends on whether they can create a joint, swap agreements and all these technical arrangements that can be the basis for lending. But these are important technical issues. Sure. I hope that they will be threshed out before the summit next year in South Africa.
But Dr. Chaulia, one of the things that has emerged is that the South Africans would like to host the bank. Politically and strategically, will it mean anything? Because some are saying that the Chinese will back that, only that they have access to the continent of Africa and perhaps then internationalize their ambitions and so on. What are your thoughts there?
There is this widespread perception that the Chinese are trying to legitimize their resource grab in Africa, and that the BRICS Development Bank could become a kind of a multilateral cover behind which China will continue to extract resources and minerals from African raw materials to feed its humongous industrial structure. But another way of looking at it is if we have parity in terms of contribution, and if we have all 5 countries prominently advertised as the donors for any infrastructure project, I think it will benefit, Africa and Latin America, because now we will have a situation where it will be easier to borrow from a genuine multilateral institution than from just one country, which is Beijing, which is suspect in the eyes of many people. So I think it is going to also benefit the other countries who are part of this, and it should not be seen as a kind of a Chinese, a Trojan horse for the Chinese. Rather, we would like to see that in the spirit of South-South cooperation, how can China's size and immense capacities be moderated and fitted into a group setting like a BRICS Development Bank? And how can that be channelized in a manner that is acceptable to all the developing countries?
Dr. Chaulia, please respond to my 2 callers here who are making a number of important points, and I'll remind you along the line, along the way, about some of the points that they are making.
Yes. Well, firstly, I think the first caller had an important issue where he was talking about public-private mix and whether it will be non-exploitative or not. Mm-hmm. From what I hear, the governments of these 5 countries are planning to actually to open it up to attract foreign capital, as in, anybody can come and buy bonds and buy, that's the whole idea of the bank. And some are seeing it as, a vehicle to actually attract more funds from the interest rate starved global north, where the cost of lending is and the gains from lending are at an all-time low because of the economic crisis.
Yeah.
And so some are seeing this as a kind of a beehive into which which will attract a lot of investors from overseas. But then the question which is corollary to that is, what will that do if the ownership is held not only by the states and their sovereign wealth, but also by private individuals and lenders who are overseas? Because then it creates this whole issue about return on investment, which takes us in a different direction away from the principles of South-South cooperation, where we are saying those who really need it will get it. If it is going to be based purely on, if the loans and the lending is going to be based purely on profitability motive, then what will happen is that pension funds, for example, which are massive investors in the West in investment banks and so on, will be demanding, and then you will have this whole shareholder democracy business, and then the moment it becomes that kind of institution, I think it becomes subject to hijack. And then you have the chances, as the speaker was saying, of it becoming one of those bubble-based banking institutions that have brought ruin to the Western world in the last 5 years. So derivatives, God forbid, I don't think the Chinese and the Indians are stupid enough as governments and as societies to allow their own bank to become gamblers in derivatives, because we know that the reasons our economies have been saved from the complete devastation of the last 5 years in the global north is because we have regulated our banks better. And I expect that even if there is a private component, that there will be enough state control over these institutions and enough public control, or else they will be subject to the same fluctuations and wild swings that we have seen in Wall Street and in the City of London. So coming to the other point about exploitation, for it to be non-exploitative, I've always argued that it cannot be left, this BRICS Development Bank, the direction and the policies cannot be just left to the state elites, many of whom also have neoliberal predilections, even though they operate in a more state-driven economic context. So the only countervailing force that we need is a great deal of social mobilization, not only among intellectuals, but among working communities, where people say that, at the end of the day, it is taxpayers' money that is what you call sovereign wealth that the state collects and which it then invests and or lends to other institutions overseas. It is the hard-earned taxpayers' money that has to be spent through taxpayers' scrutiny over what kind of infrastructure projects, what kind of development projects is this new bank going to spend. And unless we have that level of radical popular mobilization, some of the worst fears of that caller may come true. And therefore, we need a kind of checks and balances system so that the bank does not veer away in the directions of being just a sovereign wealth fund that is out to make a fast buck by, through clever investments. Rather, we are looking at how it can support the growth of societies and states in fellow developing countries.
Do you want to just quickly, before I come back here again, Doctor, do you want to respond to Professor Bond's concerns about the bank propping up extractive industries and, of course, also pushing that export-led growth?
Well, I think, as the other guest mentioned, there is a focus on developing industry and manufacturing, and to take to move some southern economies away from the model where they're being depleted of all their natural resources with no value addition that will be sustainable in the long term. The focus, I think, sustainable, as you know, the word sustainable has also been misused quite a lot in the development jargon. But here, when we mean it, we are talking about how it can enhance long-term growth prospects of the global south, rather than, as I said before, a cover for extracting resources. I think the bank should be focused, should have a kind of ideological basis which says that, we will measure every 5 years how we are emerging in terms of this overall macroeconomic growth objectives which are sustainable, rather than acting as connivers in the plunder of these, especially of Africa, that's happened for so long. Sure. So I think we have to, really create an institution that is very soundly and intelligently designed, and which has a sense of purpose. And the purpose should come not only from the governments but from the peoples who say that we need a different model to the World Bank and the IMF.
Fighting or joining, Dr. Chaulia, that's the question here. But again, what some commentators have said after this idea was put out in public was that it is one of the few instances where BRICS, for instance, have started telling us what they want as opposed to what they do not want.
Well, at the end of the day, I agree with Professor Bond when he says that, many of the BRICS nations are also recapitalizing the IMF. And I think the reason is because, we are on the cusp of a new order, but we are just on the cusp, and rather we are not into it altogether. And so the one leg in the old and, marching forward into a new one, we are somewhere in the transition period in terms of thinking about which way the world should go. Because Manmohan Singh, our Prime Minister in India, is one of the defenders of the idea that the BRICS Bank should be complementary to the existing, the World Bank and all that. And I, for instance, have been opposed to this idea. So there is a debate within India about which direction the BRICS as a whole and the bank should take. And I think ultimately, whatever happens to the institution will be determined by many of these local struggles happening within these countries about the political economy and which direction it should take. One of the callers spoke about the rights of lenders and the privileges of lenders and the rights of borrowers.
Yeah.
That is where clearly the ALBA initiative and Bank of the South have set a different trend. And I hope that Brazil will be the bridge. I have written about how Brazil, by virtue of being both in the Bank of the South and here, will charter a different path. Remember that China and Brazil and to an extent Russia are in many ways the stronger links of BRICS because they are clear about creating an alternative world order, which is in many ways countering the Western one. India and South Africa, I would say, have more of a liberal orientation to the world, which is not clearly on the left. So really, what happens in India and South Africa in many ways could be called the weaker links within the BRICS chain from the point of view of the progressives. So clearly what happens to these two societies in many ways will determine whether we are going to reproduce the neoliberalism or whether we'll chart out a new path.
Fantastic. I really thank you all for talking to me this morning. I thank Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, world politics analyst and Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs in New Delhi, joining us on the line from New Delhi this morning. Thanks indeed, Doctor.